Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of the Lineup Lab. It's been a while since I've done one of these videos, but I'm feeling particularly motivated this week because of the tournaments this past weekend for PGA DFS, particularly the Masters. There's some really big tournaments, and actually we just added a new tool on DailyFantasyWinners that's called expected putting regression. That's a really great way, especially in GPPs, to get an edge, and it's a very different tool than you'll find on most websites. So I kind of want to just talk about, strategy in majors in general, how to incorporate this putting tool well, and how to incorporate other tools that you can find online in order to make some really good GPP lineups that could win $1 million, or in the case of FanDuel, 100,000, which is not a bad chunk of change. So first, let's just get into this expected putting regression. It's a new tool on DailyFantasyWinners, and it essentially takes a stat that's called strokes gained on PGAtour.com that I'm sure you're familiar with, and it just only looks at strokes gained putting. So the reason that it only looks at strokes gained putting is I was talking with Danny and Nick, and we're trying to figure out, okay, where's their luck in golf and where's their more skill? And we were thinking, okay, well, is there really any reason a person would get more or less skilled at putting throughout their career? And we kind of came to the conclusion that we didn't think that was really true. There might be slight differences. For the most part, though, we thought that people's putting is pretty stable. And especially in the short term, when you're talking about, 5 to 10 tournaments, people who are doing really well putting or doing really poorly putting are probably just running into some sort of luck. So we decided to make a tool that can actually measure this. So the first thing we did is my brother Danny created a linear regression that basically predicts how good a putter is, how well their strokes gained average per round should be, given their strokes gained over the past 4 years. So as you can see here, if you just look at these guys, Jason Day, we predict as one of the best putters on tour. Jordan Spieth as well. This guy, Aaron Baddeley. As for the worst, Rory Sabatini, Greg Owen, Webb Simpson, Jason Duffner. These are guys who are historically have been really bad putters, and we predict them to be poor putters. So then what we do is we just simply take the strokes gained putting that you can find on PGA.tour.com, take their average per round in 2017, and we just subtract it from what we predict someone's putting skill would be. What you come up with is a lot of guys who we think are getting really lucky, a lot of guys who are getting really unlucky. So one thing to consider here is sometimes we don't have strokes gained for some players, especially guys who are new and on the European tour. So what we do is we just say they're an average putter, aka they have a 0 strokes gained, and then predict based on that. And so sometimes these diff will be really, really large, like for example with Tyrell Hatton, and we're not necessarily measuring Hatton's putting skill. So chances are Hatton is actually a very good putter, but as you can see with this, our best putter is Jason Day at a 0.6. So even if Tyrell Hatton was the best putter on tour, he still would be clearly running super hot. So basically all these negative diffs means that someone's really running really hot, and all these positive diffs means someone's really running really poorly. So in the case of the Masters, I'm just going to talk about where this worked well and where this didn't. So let's just start where it works well, because let's start with the good first. So one guy that I really liked and I actually tweeted about earlier in the week was a guy, Kevin Chappell, who ended up, if you had him, being in the winning lineup on FanDuel. Overall, he seems like a slightly poor putter, but is just running awfully in putting this year with a -1 strokes gained putting per round. He seemed like a pretty decent player, strokes gained tee to green. Like this year, he's sort of middle of the pack. Last year, I think he was probably a little better. And I thought, okay, well, you have a good player. He's low salary. It would make sense. Oh, he actually was very good in strokes gained tee to green in 2016. So we have a guy who's a pretty good player who's had a bad start to the year and especially is doing badly putting. So he's a guy I really liked and actually tweeted about. And in fact, he ended up being in the FanDuel winning lineup. And I think he was a particularly good play on FanDuel because their salary range is a lot wider. And so with a guy who's really cheap like Chappell, that's going to open you up to be able to use, 3 guys in the 9K range like Adam Scott, Justin Rose, and Phil Mickelson, and Chappell, won DW6's this tournament. So that's a great example of someone who worked well. Another one I particularly liked was Hideki Matsuyama, who we predict as a pretty average putter. He was running pretty bad this year, and I think that made him fly under the radar a little bit. If you look at the PGA ownership dashboard, which I think is free on FantasyLabs, you can see that Matsuyama, who's, in previous tournaments is clearly a good player and has had higher ownership than this in the past, kind of had a little bit of depressed ownership here at only 13.66% in the Millie Maker. So he was a guy who, flew a little under the radar, and possibly it was just because he was putting poorly. And if you actually look at the leaderboard, he did end up at 1 under with a really awesome 4th round that was, again, really, really great for FanDuel scoring, as they only score, you either only score the first 2 rounds or the second 2 rounds. One more guy, and a huge brag here, Sergio Garcia. He's been running pretty bad putting this year at a negative 0.6 strokes gained putting per round. And we rate him as a bad putter, but just not this bad. So he had a nice diff. And if you look at strokes gained tee to green, the last 2 years, Sergio is way, way up there. And I think he's way, way up there this year as well. Yes, he's very, very high. So clearly he's a good player, running bad putting. And those are the type of guys we're really looking for to use in these GPPs, because I think they're going to be guys who have depressed ownership but are really, really good players. Another guy who worked well was this guy Byung Hyun An. A kind of, decent diff at 0.4, and he did quite well. Here's what his ownership was. Let's see. So he shot +5, which was good for 33rd, but that's a pretty good score, given he's probably really, really low owned. He was only 1%. So another guy who worked well. And then lastly, Charlie Hoffman, who had a terrible 4th round, but he's a guy who is a decent putter, had about a 0.4 diff, and he's a guy that I think, in terms of strokes gained, also is pretty good. So I liked him quite a bit. Now, in terms of the fades, I think there's one guy who immediately stands out here who was really, really popular, this guy Tyrrell Hatton. I heard podcast people talking about him. He's a really, really popular play. And this is the exact type of fade that I like to do anyway in these tournaments, because the thing is with DraftKings, especially in the Millie Maker, there's going to be guys who are going to be high owned, who are running really hot, doing really well. And we want to try to fade someone, because in order to win this Millionaire Maker and get that $1 million first prize, you have to go against the field and try to get an edge in some way there. And so how I like to do that is I don't like to go, okay, Rory McIlroy, I think he's going to be high owned, let's fade him, because I think there's a good chance that, or probably like a very, very, very strong chance that Rory McIlroy is going to make the cut of this tournament almost every time and do quite well. And so he's going to be in the winning lineup a lot. But a guy like Hatton, who's not as skilled of a golfer, he's going to miss the cut a decent chunk of the time, even if he's as good as everyone thinks. And so he's a guy that I already sort of like to fade anyway. And if you look at this tool, you can see he is just putting out of his freaking mind this year. He would be the best putter on tour by a whole 1 strokes gained putting per round, which is just totally absurd. So with someone who's running this hot putting and is going to be highly owned, that I think that's a guy that I would think is a really, really easy fade for me. And if you would have looked at this tool and seen this and faded him, it would have worked out really, really well for you, because he was quite highly owned at about 27% of the Fantasy Golf Millionaire and turned out to be a bad play. So another guy who worked well as well is Adam Hadwin, who we also see he seems to be a pretty good putter, but he is definitely running hot this year, and he did make the cut but didn't do that well. And another guy that people really liked, I think, in this tournament, because he was just so cheap, but I think he was running a little hot, and I think he was also a nice fade candidate here, And one last guy who was very popular, Mark Leishman. So he did, I think, make the cut, but ended up having a terrible third round and shot +8. But he just seemed to be running real hot in putting this year. We rate him as a slightly above average putter, and he is just running absurdly hot in strokes gained putting. So I thought he was a nice fade candidate as well. Now, I'm going to say that this isn't totally perfect. So there's a couple guys where this really did not work. And I'm just going to start with Jason Day because I think this is just a good example of how this might be a little flawed, which is Jason Day is, we predict, as one of the best putters on tour. He's been putting really poorly this year. And it seems like there actually is a reason for this with personal family issues. I think his mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. He's really close with her. So clearly has been affecting his putting. I think putting is a lot mental. So it makes sense. So another guy with that this was happening with was Ryan Palmer, who I don't think played in this tournament. He's just putting absolutely terribly this year. Yet he also, I think his wife was diagnosed with cancer. So again, make sure to see that there isn't some sort of issue here that might be swaying this, because I do think putting is sort of a mental thing. But there's a couple guys where this just really didn't work who I liked, and one was Bubba Watson. So we predict him to be a pretty average putter, and he's been putting really poorly the last 2 years. And given his history at the Masters, I thought he would sort of fly under the radar and he only got 5% ownership. He's priced pretty high, but I thought, okay, this is a guy who's won the Masters, played it a lot. He's one of those lefties who, can play that fade, that long high fade that plays really well. And I think he ended up missing the cut, which is unfortunate. But he's a guy that I'm still going to keep an eye on because I do think he is running bad putting this year, and I think he could be good in future tournaments as like a really, really low-owned, under-the-radar GPP play with some high upside. Another guy who didn't work out was Jonathan Vegas, who we say is running sort of bad putting this year, and he ended up not making the cut. Russell Henley, this was one that really didn't work out. He's a good putter. It seems like he's running quite hot putting this year. And he was a high-owned play. He ended up being, where's this ownership? There you are, 10% owned, so pretty highly owned. And he ended up, I think, being in the top 20, possibly. Yeah, tied for 11th and 1 under. So that didn't work out. Another guy who didn't work out was Keimer. I'm not going to go through all the numbers, but Keimer, we said, was running hot putting. He ended up doing quite well. So yeah, there's some places where this didn't work, some places where it did. But I think that in general, what we want to do here is we want to look at a couple things. One is this guy a good player? Like, do we see from strokes gained, or if you're a member at FantasyLabs, which by the way, I highly recommend if you're doing fantasy golf, does FantasyLabs rate him well? And if he falls under one of those two things and he's running bad putting, I think those are the type of guys you want to jump on. And conversely, if you have a guy like Hatton or Hadwin, who are going to be these really high-owned guys, or even Kistner, really, who are going to be these really high-owned guys, and they have something going for them where it looks like they're running kind of hot putting, and Kistner, it doesn't look like he is actually running hot. But you have a guy like Hadwin or Hatton where, people are going to overrate them, or Leishman, because of how hot they've been running putting this year, just because it's going to affect their results. I think those guys are really great fade candidates. So, I think that in future Masters, this is going to be updated every week, and I think this is going to be a really great, great tool. And it looks like, and let's just go over the winners really quick. So on DraftKings, we do have Sergio, who would have been someone that we rated highly. And it looks like none of the other guys really came into effect, although someone who did have a lineup with Chappell, who I would have recommended, would have done quite well. That just doesn't seem like many people used him. But yeah, it seems like this... It's not really clear that this came into effect that much for the winner, side with Sergio. But I think in future Masters, you're going to see something where things go a little more wrong, and having that low-owned guy that really no one has is going to really come into effect. And the last thing I want to talk about is on FanDuel, because FanDuel actually has a really interesting scoring format, and a lot of people have been hating on it. And I actually really like it. So what they do is you pick 8 golfers, and basically their scoring only comes into effect on either rounds 1 or 2 or 3 and 4. And aside from that, if they place highly, they get bonuses for that. But it makes it sort of fun where you're trying to figure out, okay, how can I pick guys who are going to score well in the later rounds, and how can I pick guys who are going to score well in the earlier rounds? And it's funny because I actually think the guy who won here actually had kind of a bad strategy, because one thing with rounds 3 and 4, and with GPPs you can take some risks, but with rounds 3 and 4, you really don't want to take guys who have a good chance of missing the cut, because if they miss the cut, that means you're going to get a big fat 0 in scoring in these later rounds. And if you look, let's just go and see this for people who probably did have guys. Actually, okay, let's see. Wow. Let's keep going further. I can't believe someone yeah. So look, if you see here, you see this guy used Tommy Fleetwood. Tommy Fleetwood missed the cut. Well, now you get a big fat 0 there, and that's going to really, really hurt you. It's going to make it impossible to actually win a GPP. So I actually like a structure where someone uses some really cheap guys in the first round. You sort of just punt and hope they do well. And then use these big guys like McIlroy, Sergio, and John Rahm in the later rounds, because chances are they're going to make the cut. And chances are, especially if they're behind, like they're not trying to defend a lead, they're probably going to be the guys who are going to score really quite well in the later rounds. And so the funny thing is if you actually look at this, DW6er didn't really do this. He sort of had a balanced approach, and he used a really risky play, who I liked, by the way, in Chappell in rounds 3 and 4, which I just think is sort of ridiculous. I would have used him in rounds 1 and 2. And Pat Perez, who, again, it ended up working out, but was just really risky. And especially if people are not going to use a strategy where they don't punt rounds 1 and 2 and go big with rounds 3 and 4, I think you just keep doing this in GPPs, and you're going to have quite a bit of difference between you and the field. So until the strategies get better, I think it's really good to just punt on those round 1 and 2 players and find guys like Chappell, who's 5,200, who does have a ton of potential, who might be rated highly by us in this expected putting regression tool. So that was a little longer than I wanted to go, but there's a lot to cover here, and it was golf this past weekend. People won a lot of money. It was exciting stuff. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions about expected putting regression or PGA strategy, you can tweet me at MaxJSteinberg. You could also go to our forum, where we actually have a pretty active golf forum, where we go into pretty in-depth discussion, especially about the Masters. I think this thread probably had about 68 posts. So I really hope you enjoyed this. And again, any questions, tweet me, post on the forum. Excited to get back into making these videos. Going to make some baseball ones soon as well. So good luck with your lineups. Good luck with DFS, and see you later.